This is the Big Stories Podcast, where we tell the amazing and inspiring stories from across the Big 12 Conference.
Welcome back to Big Stories. I'm your host, Cleon Wall. We apologize to come to you a little late, but hey, we're here. We're wrapping up the basketball seasons for 3 schools today, but before we talk about the Kansas Jayhawks, BYU Cougars, and TCU Horned Frogs, let's get to our storylines.
The Big Stories' biggest storylines. Number 1.
And then there was one, and what a one they are. Could be the top one in the nation. We're talking about the Arizona Wildcats. They punched their ticket to the Final Four, whooping Arkansas and potential NBA lottery pick Darius Acuff Jr. 109-88. And then the Cats turned up their defense in the second half against Purdue to turn a 7-point deficit to a 15-point win. It's the first Final Four for the Wildcats in 25 years. The last single-digit game they played and won was back in the Big 12 championship against Houston. Since then, they've won by 34, 12, 21, and 15. I expect their game against Michigan to be a single-digit affair. And as a guy who has lived the majority of his life in the West, I'm glad that we have a team from the Western United States in this thing and a Big 12 team to boot. If I was going to root for a team in the Final Four, I would probably actually cheer for Illinois just because they've never won it. But I also like Arizona just because I'm a guy who's from the West who likes to support teams from the West.
Number 2.
Of the 3 Big 12 teams who won their way into the Sweet 16, I thought Houston would be the other team to make it to the Final Four. I mean, they returned most of their team that played in last season's national championship game and added 2 very good freshmen in Kingston Flemings and Chris Sinak. But almost everyone shot poorly against Illinois, and they lost by 10 to the Illini in the Sweet 16. Sinak, Flemings, and Milos Uzon combined for only 9 made shots in that game. What's next for the Cougars? We will find out more when we spend story time with them in the coming weeks, but this team will look very different next season, especially in the scoring department. Uzan, Fleming, Sinak, and Emmanuel Sharp will all be gone. It will be fascinating who will be the scorers for Kelvin Sampson next season.
Number 3.
While I thought Houston was the most likely second Big 12 team to make the Final Four, I was kind of hoping Iowa State would sneak in. The Cyclones have had plenty of good teams, but they've only ever made it to the Final Four once, and that was back in 1944. Alas, playing without all-conference forward Joshua Jefferson finally caught up to them. Jefferson, point guard Tamin Lipsey, and reserve guard Nate Heisey are all out of eligibility, which will shake this team up next season. By the way, Jefferson is expected to be picked in the second round of the upcoming NBA draft. If sharpshooter Milan Momcilovic decides to leave after his junior campaign, some think he will also be picked in the second round.
Number 4.
In the women's NCAA tournament, only TCU made it to the Elite 8, and unfortunately, they ran into the buzzsaw known as the South Carolina Gamecocks. The Horned Frogs were outscored by 18 in the fourth quarter alone and lost 78-52. Shooting 33% from the field will do you in. It ends the college career of the ultra-talented Olivia Miles. She was a blast to watch with the ball in her hands. Now, if we could only unseat the South Carolinas and UConns of this world and get a Big 12 team in the Final Four. The last time a team from the conference made it to the Final Four, Baylor. They won it all in 2019. The time before that, Baylor, and they won it all in 2012. There were a couple of teams who didn't make it to the big dance, but did pretty well in the small mosh pit known as the WBIT. Both BYU and Kansas made it to the Final Four, only to face off against each other in one semifinal in Wichita, Kansas. It would have been a bit more fun if they would have faced each other in the final. Anyway, BYU moves on after beating the Jayhawks 70-67. 2 freshmen led the way in the second half for the Cougars, at least on the scoring end. Olivia Hamlin scored 14 of her 23 points after the break. Fellow Frosh Sydney Benali hit 2 huge three-pointers within a minute of each other to stretch BYU's lead from 1-7 late in the game. Benali scored 15 in the game. All right, it's story time now, and we begin with the Kansas Jayhawks. The biggest news for the Jayhawks this season was health. Bill Self was hospitalized during the season out of caution. He eventually resumed coaching. He's had health problems in the past and said that his future would be determined on how he feels and not necessarily what's happening with his team. We're still waiting to hear what he's going to do next. Then you have freshman sensation Darryn Peterson, who has had problems with cramps and injuries this season, which has caused him to miss games or be pulled from games early. In fact, there was a national media firestorm from leaving a few games early. So when I talked to voice of the Jayhawks, Brian Hanni, I asked him how Peterson's problems influenced how this team played this season.
Great question, Cleon. And I'll tell you, it was one of those deals where his availability or lack thereof in the middle of the year really forced Kansas to have two separate teams on the floor. And typically, you establish your identity as a team, if not by the end of non-con play, sometime early in league play. And what we say around here at Kansas is by Valentine's every year, mid-February, Bill Self's got the team hitting on all cylinders, cooking with a full head of steam. Here we go, baby. But this was a team that, for 11 games, they didn't have Darryn, and for a handful of others, including the game that BYU fans saw where he just played primarily in the first half, and then you didn't have him in the second half. It was kind of two separate teams, two separate identities. And so, to be honest, I think it did stunt some progress and momentum of this group. Now, obviously, as more came to light late in the season and in the postseason of what he'd been dealing with, it made sense. But it was an unenviable and unfortunate set of circumstances for both the player, the coach, and the team to try to navigate that, because as you saw firsthand in that first half of the BYU game, when he's healthy and turned up, he's as good as anybody.
Yeah.
But because there were other games where he tried to play through it but was more tentative or just wasn't able to finish the full game or even go 25 minutes, it really forced Bill Self into a unique set of circumstances that I'm not sure he's had before. We've had plenty of player injuries and inavailability to fight through, but this was such a tough one to get a handle on just based on when the cramping was going to flare up and when he might have to tap out, that it created a whole different kind of challenge that I'm not sure many have had to take on.
From afar, I thought Kansas would turn into that powerhouse that we're used to after they beat Arizona at home, and that's when Arizona was ranked first in the nation. Then they were humbled by the Iowa State Cyclones on the road, and they had a few more humbling losses along the way, including a 22-point beatdown to Houston at the Big 12 tournament. In the end, why do you think this team struggled, unlike some of the other Kansas teams in the past?
Well, it was truly a wild case of a club that was able to beat anybody on any given day, but maybe also lose to just about anybody, at least in the Big 12, on any given day. And we rarely ever see that at Kansas. I mean, to put it in perspective, Bill Self has a 94.5% home court winning percentage. And this group, in its toughest home slate in the history of Allen Fieldhouse, 3 top 5 teams. You've got BYU, who was top 15 at the time, all on the home schedule. And they beat Arizona without DP at home. They beat Iowa State at home. They beat Houston at home. They beat BYU, but then they lose going away at home to Cincinnati, the ultimate head scratcher. And that's not to say Cincinnati wasn't a capable team, but that type of one extreme to the other inconsistency is what plagued this club a lot this year and what ultimately kept them from being seated higher on Selection Sunday and put them in an unenviable round of 32 matchup with St. John's, who was a 5 seed on the bracket, but as you well know, was ranked 10th in the country and as hot as anybody, coming into March Madness. It was KU stubbing its toe with those inconsistencies that I think a lot had to do with offensive inconsistency that led to some surprising losses, some head scratchers. Obviously, there's no shame in losing at UCF, but when you lose at UCF and at West Virginia in 2 of your first 3 league games, when you're a club that's used to winning your conference opener for 33 straight years prior to last year, that was a little atypical. And when you had other stub your toe games like at Arizona State, who I know beat a lot of teams in Tempe, but that's normally the type of game that Kansas would find a way to win. And so this was just a group that, simply put, struggled with consistency one game to the next. A lot of that has to do with what we talked about earlier with the two identities to this team. But their offensive efficiency really went in the tank over the last month of the year. And we saw some players that at times made great contributions, like Melvin Council, the Big 12 newcomer of the year, and Trey White, who wasn't decorated by the league but was an outstanding player for much of the season. We saw great contributions, and then they get in the postseason, and the shooting numbers just fell through the floor. And this was a club that I just think labored to score at times, whether it was because guys early in the year were standing around watching Darryn and thus were less assertive and aggressive offensively, or if the shots just dried up. I mean, that game you referenced versus Houston, we lost by 22. Thanks for bringing it up, Cleon. We opened the second half 0 of 17. I've never seen that before. Not just in my 10 years as the voice, but in my 45 years as a Kansas fan. I've never seen that before. And this is a club that probably has 3 NBA players on it. But there were just some offensive inconsistencies that could become contagious and spread roster wide, that we had a couple of games where it just looked like we couldn't throw it in the ocean. And you rarely ever see that at Kansas. I think that was a big part of it.
You mentioned some of the other Jayhawks who really contributed to this team when you talked about Melvin Council Jr., Trey White. You have Flory, who's been a fabulous freshman too for you. Who on this team, and it could be any of those guys, or it could be someone else, who on this team has not been talked about enough in terms of production, who really did some good things on the court this season for the Jayhawks?
Wow, that's a great question. You know, I will say this constructively. We did not have the bench contributions that we thought we were going to have. And so normally when somebody phrases a question like that, it's a dark horse that's giving you great sixth man minutes. I'm not sure we ever fully found that sixth man that we were hopeful to find. And that's another reason why we're talking about this at the time of taping, and I'm not getting ready to go to the Final Four like we all dreamed back in October. The bench depth on this team wasn't as good. Within the starting lineup, I think the guys that, were most consistently productive got enough run and accolade to where the only answer I could give you might be the fact that Bill really felt like Trey White was snubbed with not even an honorable mention in the Big 12. He went through a 2-week stretch where he was dealing with some health stuff and his numbers kind of bottomed out. But if you look at his overall, 18-game sample size, 13 or 14 of those 18 games, he was awfully good as a 15-point-per-game guy that helped on the glass, 6 boards a game. He was our most consistent free throw shooter and got to the line 125 times this year, hitting at an 87% clip. I think Darryn Peterson casts a pretty big shadow. Flory Bidunga as the defensive player of the year and Melvin Council as the Big 12 newcomer of the year. They get a lot of headlines too. And so Trey probably didn't get as much love as he deserved. But normally I'd tell you a 6th or 7th man, and I'm not sure this club ever had consistently what they normally would have in the Bill Self era off the bench.
We've talked a lot about whether Darryn Peterson or BYU's AJ Dybantsa will be number one or be the number one overall pick in the NBA draft. I know I could argue for Dybantsa, you could argue for Peterson, so let's just go with that. Why would you argue that Darryn Peterson should be the number one pick or at least succeed at the next level?
Yeah, great question. And obviously it was based on productivity this year. You can understand why AJ would move ahead of Darryn. But I feel like if Darryn can put whatever these cramping issues were clearly in the rearview mirror and prove through the pre-draft workouts and combine stuff that everything's good to go and it's a mere blip on the radar, you're talking about a guy that Bill Self said was the most talented player he'd ever recruited. Self also had Joel Embiid, an NBA MVP. In that same recruiting class, he had Andrew Wiggins, the number one pick in the draft. He had the National Player of the Year, Frank Mason. He had other top 5 picks, including Josh Jackson, and the list goes on and on. But the point is, he said of all those guys, Peterson was the most gifted. And Bill, as recently as 1 week left in the season, said, we still haven't seen the Darryn Peterson in terms of his explosion and the full-blown athleticism when he's not hampered or limited in any way type athleticism that they recruited him to show at Kansas. So what I'm getting at is, if that version returns, there's a very compelling case, because if you go back to preseason, September, October, you had a lot of national guys like Bill Simmons saying, this is Kobe Bryant 2026. And not saying he's going to be everything Kobe was as a 5-time NBA champion, but do I think he's a perennial NBA All-Star? I actually do, if health is on his side. It's a big if. Obviously, your best ability is availability, right? That's more of a football line than basketball. But if he can prove some of these health challenges are behind him, there is a natural feel to the game, an incredible scoring capability, a defensive side to Darryn that we saw a little bit of in the BYU game when he had those 3 or 4 first half steals, but we didn't see sustained over the whole season that I think fans don't even realize is there. There's a killer instinct, alpha with the ball in his hands aspect to Darryn that we only scrape the tip of the iceberg of this year at Kansas that I think you'll see more and more of. So, hey, man, I know back in the early 80s, the team picking third in Chicago lucked out and got a pretty good guy when Sam Bowie went number 2 and what was it, Worthy won in that draft? No,
I think it was Hakeem.
It was Hakeem won.
Hakeem
won in that draft.
Yeah.
And I don't know where Darryn goes, if it's 2, if it's 1, whatever. And whoever picks AJ is going to wind up with a generational talent too. But if Darryn were to slide at all, this could be another one of those drafts where you're like, wow, what a value, because in any other year, he would be number 1 with a bullet. I think he's that good.
Again, that's Brian Hanni, the voice of the Kansas Jayhawks. Coming up after the break, we talk to BYU SportsNation co-host Jarom Jordan and Frogs Insider podcast host Melissa Trebwasser. You are listening to the Big Stories podcast from BYU Radio. Welcome back to Big Stories. I'm Cleon Wall. As we talked about on this podcast previously, the BYU Cougars, their fans, and lots of experts thought this was the year BYU would finally make it to the Final Four. I mean, they had potential top draft pick AJ Dybantsa on their squad and a bunch of other good players around him. Then they ended up exiting in the first round to Texas. So I asked BYU SportsNation co-host Jarom Jordan how he would evaluate the ups and downs of this year's squad.
Huge expectations preseason by external analysts. When the Lone Peak 3 signed at BYU, it was internally talking about the Final Four. That was not this. This was Seth Greenberg, Sean Farnham, to me saying, Final Four good, national championship good. So then we got excited. So for BYU to bow out in the first round because of injuries, it's the most disappointing season in BYU history, in my opinion, in men's basketball, because they had the number 1 pick and they had the pieces and they had the roster. Unfortunately, injuries made this happen. There were some real highs. BYU beat 2 top 10 teams at home without Richie Saunders. They seemingly started to figure it out, and then unfortunately Texas caught fire and nearly made the Elite 8. It's another BYU's a 6 seed playing a play-in first 4 11 seed power conference team, 21 UCLA, made a run to the Final Four. Texas almost did that too.
Yeah.
So that was tough, and BYU had an opportunity to do something special and unfortunately did not. The special thing was AJ Dybantsa, and that story is still being written. We were talking about the best thing about the season, biggest accomplishment on the show today, and I said it still hasn't happened. It said AJ Dybantsa will be the number 1 pick. When that happens, that is the best moment from the season. I know that's not within the season, but it's all part of it. AJ was amazing, led the nation in scoring, first-team All-American. BYU's only had 2 other dudes ever do that. It's obvious who those 2 are. That's incredible company. It's too bad it didn't yield the team results we wanted, but we saw greatness in AJ, and that was fun to watch.
I think a lot of people, and I focused a lot on Richie Saunders. When he went out with that ACL injury, you're just like, I'm not sure where BYU goes from here. So yeah, that was a huge blow, but I think there were other guys that kind of were smaller blows earlier in the season. Who's the one guy that you would say outside of Richie that it really hurt this BYU team not having him on the court later in the season?
Dawson Baker was tough. That was in mid to late November, and that was your kind of bench scorer. He was actually starting for a little while Kennard Davis was out. Fifth-year senior, a guy who scored over 1,000 points from his career at UC Irvine and BYU, a guy that can find his shot, really helped against UConn in some critical moments there. That win, or that close loss, looks better for BYU as time goes on. You go, wow, they competed there. That one was big. And then Nate Pickens was one people don't talk about or understand. Nate Pickens came from UC Riverside. He was going to back up Rob Wright III. He was going to be kind of a 3-and-D guy, spell Rob a little bit, toughness. And the staff talks about, hey, people don't talk about that one as much. So that was tough. Brody Kozlowski was supposed to kind of start playing a little bit. He's a really good rebounder who can shoot threes at a high level. kind of would have played the minutes that Mihailo Boskovic played at times. That was significant. Xavier State, I don't know, was going to have a big impact on the year, kind of your third-string center. He gets hurt. The combination of Richie, Dawson, Nate, and then you add kind of those other two in, just too much to overcome, unfortunately. But it's tough because BYU did beat 2 top 10 teams without those guys at the end of the regular season. And then they played well in Kansas City. It just didn't translate into the tourney against Texas. I think if BYU had won one game in the tourney and lost to Gonzaga, we'd go, hey, that was fine. But the fact that they lose that first game, it's like, no tournament wins with AJ and company. That was a bummer.
Now we're going to jump back to AJ again. What has his presence on and off the court here in Provo meant for this BYU team? Because we can see that the season did not end the way anyone here in Provo wanted it to end. But still, and a lot of people will say, wow, what a wasted season. You had a guy that's going to probably be the number 1 overall pick in the NBA draft, and you can't get out of the first round of the NCAA tournament. But I would guess that just him being here means a lot for Provo. What do you think it meant for him just to come to BYU?
There's been some interesting, what's the ROI on AJ conversations last week or two. Seth Greenberg, Stephen A. Smith, the most vocal of those at ESPN. I vehemently disagree with what they said, which was like, I don't know if it was worth it for him. It was completely worth it to have AJ here because it's not just about this year. That's very narrow-minded. It's you got Yegor, you got AJ, you got another incoming top 10 guy that in one mock for the 27 draft is number 2. I can't say his name yet because he hasn't officially signed. He will in a couple weeks. BB3, McDonald's All-American. He's awesome. The fact that that guy comes here tells you it wasn't just a one-off with Yegor and maybe just a two-off with AJ. Getting AJ Dybantsa was the biggest recruiting move in BYU sports history, any sport. It was unbelievable. I still can't believe he came here and played here, and he will carry BYU with him throughout his NBA career. The dividends will be over in the next 20 to 30 years because BYU's entered the conversation as outside the Blue Bloods. Wait, I can go there with that former NBA assistant and develop and be a lottery pick. Yegor Demon had a great rookie year until his foot injury. AJ Dybantsa could be the number 1 pick. This next guy's projected top 5. BYU's never had this in any sport, this run of top-end talent. Can they support these people? Can they validate it with more wins in the NCAA tournament? Certainly, you're working on that. There was a Sweet 16 just a year ago, don't forget, and that was a special group, and BYU unfortunately had injuries. But then you bring in another group next year, and trust me, in the portal, BYU is going to get some dudes. They'll be right in the mix again, be top 25 most of the year. BYU's elevated. It is different. NIL has allowed BYU to pursue and get certain people that never would have come here with great coaches. NIL and the Big 12, that combination has taken BYU into a space they've never been in. And here we go. It's not just once a generation you find a random amazing kid from Eugene and Glens Falls, New York. It's no, we got the number 1 dude in the country here. And hey, we get another top 10 guy. Then we had a top international prospect in Yegor. It's special what's happening right now. And it's going to yield in a crazy run in the NCAA tournament at some point. We wanted it this year. Hopefully it's next year.
I just talked to Brian Hanni, who's the voice of the Kansas Jayhawks, and I said, make an argument on why Darryn Peterson should be the number 1 pick in the draft, or at the very least, a very, very good player in the NBA. And he goes, well, if he slides, I mean, and I know Brian, these guys talk this way because they are very invested in their team. But Brian said, there was that guy back in, 84, who slid all the way to number 3, and he turned out to be pretty good. Of course, he's talking about Michael Jordan. But I want you to do the same thing for me. Why should AJ Dybantsa be the number 1 pick in the NBA draft?
He's the most ready offensive player right now. No one can really block his shot, contest him a ton. He can kind of get what shot he wants, and he's got a really good mid-range. He can finish at the rim with both hands super well. Footwork's incredible. He does need to work on his three-point shot a little bit, but he's the most ready right now. Darryn Peterson's really polished offensively, and he's going to be a very good player as well. But there are questions about Darren's durability, given that he cramped up a bit and had issues. He'd come out of games and whatnot when there were big moments. He didn't play in some of the big games. It's like, why aren't you even out there trying? It was just kind of odd. So AJ won over people by 40-plus point performances and triple-doubles and his ability to just rise up and dunk. He looks like an NBA player right now. He's a jumbo wing, 6'9" frame, 7'1" wingspan. He's ready to go. I think AJ averages 18 a game next year out of the gate. I think Cam Boozer's ready to go too.
Yeah.
I think he's really good, and he'll be like a 17-8 guy for anybody, contender or not, right away. So there's some real good talent. Then I'm excited to see kind of where these guards go the rest of the way, hoping the Jazz get a high pick and they can get an AJ or a Darryn or a Cam Boozer. If not, I like the crew of Darius Acuff Jr. from Arkansas and Kingston Flemings from Houston and so on and so forth. So it'll be a fun NBA draft. I dare say this last college basketball season was one of the greatest ever. Great freshman crew. NIL's keeping a lot of these guys in school. The talent spread out more. I know the one seed sort of emerged and did really well, but there's so much talent in the game, and it was fun to watch. And for BYU to be a part of that was cool.
You mentioned guys that BYU, the transfer portal is going to yield people coming to BYU. Who or what kind of a player does BYU need next season? We know that AJ, well, I shouldn't say we know, at least at this point, but everything points to AJ not coming back next year. What is it that BYU needs next season to keep them in that conversation of top of the Big 12 and advancing in the NCAA tournament?
I think you need to keep Rob Wright III. I think that is a crucial piece. And then you need a couple of wing scorers. And then you need a low post scorer that can give you something there. Foose off the bench 2 years ago was nice because if BYU was in a rut, you throw it into him. He's going to get you a couple buckets here and there. BYU did not have that this year. Also, Keba Keita injured his hand where he couldn't grip the ball for like a full month. That affected him on both ends of the court. And then BYU kind of got chewed up in the NCAA tournament against a big in Matas Vokatitis. So that's where I kind of look is you need shooters. That's the, quote, holy grail, according to Kevin Young, in the postgame after Texas said, we need more shooters. If they had more shooters surrounding Rob and AJ, I think things would have been a little different too. And then, yeah, a big, like I mentioned. So there's guys in the portal that are LDS, that are interesting. There are others who are not, that are very interesting as well. So I'm super confident that with BYU's resources, coaching, and league situation, that BYU will have a very good roster going into next year. It'd be preseason top 25, and we'll have another fun year.
That, again, was BYU Sports Nation co-host Jarom Jordan. Finally, it's time to talk about TCU basketball. This is a team that struggled early in the conference season. Then they won 5 straight games at the end of the regular season, finished 6th in the Big 12, beat Ohio State in the first round of the NCAA tournament, and played Duke fairly tough before succumbing to them in the second half. So I asked Melissa Trebwasser from the Frogs Insider podcast how she would grade the latter half of the season now that everything is settled.
I mean, I don't think I'm the only person that looks back on this year in full and says it's the best coaching job of Jamie Dixon's career, at least his TCU portion of his career. This is a team that lost to the University of New Orleans on night one, that lost their starting center about 7.5 minutes into that game and looked really out of sorts for a considerable time after. Then you saw them, almost beat Michigan, lose a heartbreaker at home to Notre Dame, go and beat Florida and Wisconsin in back-to-back days at a Thanksgiving tournament. And so there was a lot of unevenness in the first, in the non-conference portion of the slate. But this team got really good at closing games towards the end of the season. They competed really hard in an incredibly challenging Big 12 conference, and finishing 6th when you were projected to finish 10th, especially when you lose your starting center so quickly into the year. This is an overwhelming success when you look at what this team was on paper, what it looked like the beginning of the season, and how they finished.
You talked about how they learned how to close games. Were there any other things that you noticed that helped this team go from meh to, wow, hey, they're looking really good?
Yeah, they bought in, especially on the defensive end of the floor. And I think that when you look to last year's team, maybe on paper looked more talented. This year's team was more bought in together as a unit. And what they did defensively, especially with how undersized that backcourt was at times, is really, really impressive. I mean, the games that they won and the teams that they beat because they locked in on defense and they rebounded well above their size and the size discrepancy they often faced. And so for Jamie to finally have a team that played the way that he wanted a team to play and has wanted a team to play for 10 plus years in Fort Worth, it was really great to see him rewarded with a team that could not just play hard but win games.
Now, TCU has been to the NCAA tournament 5 times during Jamie Dixon's tenure. Each time, the team has either been bounced in the first or the second round. Of course, this past year, they were bounced in the second round. What gives you hope that things will be different either next year or the next year so that we could actually say, hey, you know what? TCU made it to the Sweet 16.
I mean, that's the goal. That's the dream, right? It's uncharted territory for this program. But I think the thing that's really difficult in this era of college basketball is it's hard to have hope until you know who's staying. And I guess I hate to couch it like this, but for me, the hope comes in that not only did the players buy in, but the fan base did too. And what they did down the stretch might rally the support that this program needs from a financial and resources standpoint from outside of the TCU walls. It sucks that that's what it comes down to. But at the end of the day, I mean, TCU is probably a bottom third team in terms of financial resources in the Big 12 and finish sixth. I think that if you get people that are invested and believe in this program based off of what they've shown you and they say, hey, we want to make sure we can keep this young core of guys that are so bought into TCU and care about TCU and love TCU, but are going to be getting calls, then I think you can be really excited. If they manage to hold on to Xavier Edmonds and David Punch and Micah Robinson and some of these other young players, then you think, man, like this core is a core that can go out and finish top 5 in the Big 12 and can be, you know, instead of being on that god awful 8-9 line, maybe can be a 6th seed. And now you're avoiding having to play a 1 seed in the second round. And now you're thinking, not only do we have the talent, but maybe the matchups play in our favor too.
By the way, isn't it interesting depending on which team it is? I mean, some people are saying, you know, if you're a basketball blue blood, you're thinking 1, 2, 3 seed at the worst. And we're talking about TCU and you're like, hey, if they could be a 6 seed.
Anything but an 8 or 9, please. And I would have rather them been a 10, frankly, you know, than have to be in that 8-9 line. And they look like they were going to be a 10 for a while. And then they look like they might be a 6 for a while. But they ended up having to play in that against that 1 seed and the officials, in the second round. So
Oh, well. You mentioned David Punch and Micah Robinson and the young guys who really brought it this season. What would it mean to this team, and what do you think this team could look like next year with those guys returning?
Yeah, I mean, David Punch's trajectory says future NBA player. Right. He's gone from a freshman who was an all-conference level player and kind of freshman All-American level player to a kid that they really leaned on down the stretch of the season and was at his best in the biggest moments. I think he's got some work to do. And you think about who does he play with and how does he play with other guys that might be on this roster. But at the end of the day, he's physically imposing. He's defensive oriented. He's a good rebounder. He's a super crafty and creative scorer. He's stretched his game out, to the midpoint and the 3-point line enough to be effective. He's the kind of kid you want to build around long term because he gets it. He works his tail off. He's an incredible character. He's a great young leader. And he loves this team and this program, and he loves Jamie Dixon. And so if you can say that's going to be our core, and we're going to add a Micah Robinson, who's another kid who, scored 18 points in each of the March Madness games, really lit up from behind the arc, and is just such a great defensive presence at the wing. Those two guys that have been here from the beginning of their career, if they are guys that finished their career at TCU, you really think you can build a competitive program. They've got a JUCO center coming in. They've got a JUCO point guard. Brock Harding at times was frustrating, but I thought played his best basketball at the end of the season and really just did a great job of protecting the ball and facilitating. And so he'll be back next year, you anticipate. So there'll be some areas to address in the portal no matter what happens. But if you told me Micah Robinson and David Punch and maybe even Xavier Edmonds were all going to be on this team a year from now, I would feel like TCU, we're talking about previewing a Sweet 16 matchup as opposed to talking about TCU at the end of the season at this time a year from now.
Coach Dixon has now coached in Fort Worth for 10 seasons now. Listen, I don't know how much you know about how happy he is there, but it is his alma mater. Mm-hmm. Do you see him leaving for any reason at all? He's not old enough, I would think, to retire, and he's had success at TCU. He also had success at Pittsburgh, too. Is he happy coaching at his alma mater right now?
This is such a double-edged sword question because is he happy coaching at TCU? Yes. Does he love the coaching aspect of it? Yes. Does he love the kids and the players that he's able to grow as men at that university with the resources that are around him? Yes. Does he like college basketball today in the NIL era? Absolutely not. And he'll be completely open about it. And if anything is going to drive some of these guys that aren't quite old enough to retire, but have been doing this for a long time out of the game, it's going to be NIL in the transfer portal. And if you're Jamie Dixon and you say, this is what it's going to take to keep these 3 or 4 guys, and that money doesn't appear and they leave and you got to start all over again, I don't know how much more he wants to do that. And I'm not revealing any secrets here. You put a mic in front of Jamie Dixon, he's going to tell you he hates having to think about money and how he's going to pay players. And the fact that the minute his season ends, the first thing he's got to do is, oh my gosh, now I have to keep them. Now I have a retention plan. Now I have to fundraise. And it's so interesting because you look on the opposite side in the women's program at TCU and Mark Campbell, who is an absolute portal master. And you look at Jamie Dixon, who's like, I can't believe I have to do this at this stage of my career. It's so funny. They're different philosophies. But Jamie almost left, what was that, in 2017, I think, or 2018, right after that NIT run or the first time they made the NCAA tournament to go to UCLA, which was, where his parents are and being closer to home. I don't think he has a big desire to uproot and leave unless he was going to a place that was going to make sure, he was the most resources in a conference. Playing in the Big 12 is a grind. You guys are well aware of that as well. And there's opportunities there to really elevate your program, but it's also really hard when you're constantly fighting uphill. And that's what Jamie Dixon feels like he's been doing at TCU. And you just wonder how much more he wants to do that. I think he still loves the game and he still has a passion for developing these kids. But this is a very different era of basketball than what he did when he even started at TCU. He's elevated this program. He's taken it from being truly a national embarrassment to a competitive program that expects to be in the NCAA every year. And that if you had told me when I was a student that was going to happen, I would never have believed you. So he's done what he needs to do at TCU. I don't think he has any inkling of leaving. Will there be some interesting jobs open this offseason that maybe they want to pick up the phone and give him a call? Sure. But I don't think he's going to be looking to hightail it out of town anytime soon. He doesn't want to start over again, is my impression.
A big thanks to Melissa Trebwasser, Brian Hanni, and Jarom Jordan for joining us on the Big Stories podcast. No episode this Thursday, but we will be back next week with more storylines and amazing tales from the Big 12. This episode was produced by Garrett Glauser. I'm your host, Cleon Wall, and Big Stories is a production of BYU Radio.